2 weeks ago, Russia announced it will suspend diplomatic relations with NATO and close its mission in Moscow. While that order comes into effect today, it comes after the alliance expelled 8 Russian diplomats claiming they were secretly working as spies. So what does this new freeze in relations mean for both blocs going forward? Well, joining me now to tell us more is NATO's former Assistant Secretary General, Jamie Shea. Jamie, I'm sure you can shed some light on this issue. Let me begin by asking you, what was the role of the NATO Military Liaison Office in Moscow?
NATO, in fact, had 2 offices in Moscow, which now have both been closed. One, as you rightly say, was the military liaison mission, which maintained contacts with the Russian Ministry of Defense, tried to generate a bit more transparency on exercises, particularly those very large, short-notice snap exercises, which Russia has carried out recently along NATO's borders. They had exchanges on doctrine, on procurement, on budgets. The whole idea was to sort of build confidence and also allow NATO to explain that its own military activities were quite modest, were defensive, and not a threat to Russia. The other office was an information office which tried to sort of get inside the Russian media space, which is often very hostile to NATO talks, as you know, and allow NATO to get its sort of voice across in the media, in universities, in think tanks, and so on. A bit of an uphill struggle, but the fact that these 2 offices were there, talks, at least showed that Russia sort of acknowledged NATO existed, acknowledged its legitimacy, and always sort of, hope for better days in terms of being able to pursue more constructive NATO-Russia relations.
So how serious a setback then is this for relations between the East and West?
Well, I don't think it's a major setback, given that these 2 offices were pretty paralysed since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea. And NATO sort of broke off practical cooperation with Russia. The diplomats that NATO sent to Moscow were declared, as diplomats like to say, persona non grata. They had to come back to Brussels, although local staff remained. So the offices couldn't really function. NATO kept them open, of course, because closing them, which has now happened, would make it more difficult to restart them in the future. But clearly now NATO has to look for other channels of communication with Russia. We have to talk to Russia even while we're in an atmosphere of confrontation. But of course, all of the allies, all of the 30 allies talks have their embassies in Moscow. NATO has a so-called contact point embassy. That's a national embassy which represents NATO's affairs. And the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, the most senior NATO commander, does have a hotline to the Russian Chief of Defense, General Gerasimov, and they hold occasional meetings in places like Kazakhstan. So it's always the case, Tox, that when people want to talk to each other, that they find a channel quite easily.